What's in your mind now as you look at the battle map in Ukraine as we head into the winter? Still a lot of attention for obvious reasons around Kherson.
Yes, it's interesting that if you look at the front line between the two protagonists as a whole, it's pretty static, and it's been that way for 2 or 3 weeks now. Both sides making very small gains on a daily basis, but nothing significant, frankly. Kherson in the south, however, is where all the eyes are focused, because this was the first seriously big town the Russians took in February of this year, and it matters a lot to Ukraine to take it back, because that would throw the Russians all onto the east bank of the Dnieper River, which cuts Ukraine in half, and it would begin to allow Ukraine to threaten the land routes into Crimea, which have always been one of the main Russian objectives. And it's just not at all clear how this battle is going to go. Some think that the Russians will stay and fight, and it'll be a very bloody encounter. Others think the Russians will draw Ukrainian forces in, and when they have inflicted enough damage, slip away across the river without being trapped or defeated.
Yes.
And the Ukrainians know, since this will be a fight for a big urban area about the size of Southampton, that this could be a very long and bloody affair. And we shouldn't expect it to be something that's very clear very quickly. This could rumble on through the winter, particularly if the Russians stick and hold.
Would it suit Russia, and how would it suit Russia to have a, I don't know, a street by street battle in the city of Kherson? I mean, given the way the conflict has been going, the best thing would be on Ukraine winning that battle ultimately. Although, as you say, it would be a bloody affair.
Well, it's a very interesting prospect. We know that some of the Russian forces in Kherson are the best that they can find, airborne forces. We know that they've had since February to prepare this city for defense, so to build obstacles and shelters and stockpile ammunition and that kind of thing. And so the Ukrainian side would know very well that if they have to fight for Kherson, it will be like any battle for a built-up area. It will be very intensive in terms of casualties and the consumption of ammunition. And the Ukrainian side will worry that they lose, that they don't succeed in taking the city, but they do take an awful lot of casualties, and that begins to dishearten the population after what's been a really long year. And from the Russian side, well, they will really worry that they get defeated in Kherson because their best troops in there, because they probably tried to defend it too long. And then that would put at risk some of the other gains that they've made elsewhere in Ukraine.
So a lot of, I know, psychological, symbolic value to Kherson, whichever way that goes. But as we head now into the winter, where, I know, mobile fighting, to use that expression, becomes more difficult. Some suggest the conflict could slow down and to some extent freeze. What is the balance of the war now? Every story, every account of what's going on suggests that Ukraine is doing remarkably well in the broad span of the war so far. But as we head into the winter, how do you see the balance?
So the first thing is we're in autumn now, and it's really wet. So that makes moving heavy vehicles like tanks, even with tracks, and certainly trucks and wheeled artillery across open country, really difficult. But we should, however, recognize that when the winter kicks in Ukraine and the ground and the rivers freeze, then for some bits of military equipment, maneuvering across country gets easier again. But for both sides, it will remain really cold and many fewer hours of daylight. So everything just gets harder when you're trying to fight in the winter. And I think the basic position for both sides now is both sides are running short of trained manpower. They can both acquire more people and train them up. And both sides are short of weapons, and particularly ammunition. And so I think one of the reasons we're seeing the fighting slowing up along the length of the front line is not just because it's very boggy, but also because, frankly, both sides are a bit worn out at this moment.
Is it reasonable to anticipate that when we head into the winter, then the Russian focus, a part of the Russian focus, will be on seeking to shift, maybe weaken the resolve of Ukraine's Western allies, to get more European allies of Ukraine to line up behind the idea of urging, maybe prompting Ukraine to the negotiating table to look for some sort of settlement, even if Ukraine are not that keen on that outcome?
So I think we can see Russia trying to do three things at once now. It's maintaining the battle for territory, and we've talked about the fight for Kherson in particular at the minute. It is focusing more effort on depleting the will of the Ukrainian people to keep going, and that's behind this rash of successful drone attacks and missile attacks on the Ukrainian electricity infrastructure. That's designed to keep currently today 4.5 million Ukrainians without electricity just as it starts to get cold and dark. That I don't think is going to work. The Ukrainian population remain, it seems to me, really resolute. And the third thing the Russians are going to try and do is to try and deplete our Western will to supply Ukraine with not just political support, but money and weapons and ammunition and training. Because without that, Ukraine will not be able to overcome the Russian presence in its country. And we're going to see that focused on a range of European countries. So not just gas supplies, but also cyber attacks. And we in the UK should recognize that we are now just a few days away from the autumn statement, where we're going to have to come to terms with spending cuts and tax rises. And we should recognize that Russian propaganda and other efforts will be focused on that to try and say, well, look, you should focus on your own problems and stop sending the 2.3 billion pounds a year you're currently sending to the Ukrainian military effort. And we should recognize that our national interest is not being swayed by that kind of pressure.